The past as our guide, the future as our canvas. Standing at the threshold of 2026, we look back on a year full of momentum and milestones. How shall we review 2025 from China's perspective? Which stories left the most lasting impact and what lies ahead in 2026? Welcome to this special year-end edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin, coming to you from Beijing. I'm pleased to be joined sometime later on the line from West Bengal, India, by Professor Jorge Sachs, Director of the Center for Sustainable Development and Columbia University. From Shanghai via Zoom by Professor Zhang Weiwei, Dean of the China Institute at Fudan University. From Zapala, Chile by Jorge Heine, former Chilean ambassador to China and author of a new book, The Non-Aligned World. And last but not least, from Portland, America, by Liang Yan, Kremer Chair Professor of Economics at William Met University. The warmest welcome to all of you and Happy New Year. So first of all, an open question to all of you. As I mentioned, as we all know, 2025 has been a year of profound turbulences and transformation. The Ukraine crisis has yet to be settled. The situation in Gaza remains volatile. Trump's tariffs war on the world has shaken the multilateral trading system without bringing any tangible benefits to the United States. Professor Zhang, let me start with you. Against this sinister backdrop, which word would you choose to describe the global landscape of 2025, and where does China fit in?
Two words. For the world as a whole, it's full of uncertainty. In the case of China, China provides certainty for this uncertain world. Economically, China's experience for this whole year, 2025, can only be described as extraordinary. Obviously, Donald Trump launched this tariff war, which ended, now nominally in ceasefire. Actually, it's complete failure for the United States. And then if you look at China's important role in terms of sustainable development, China really has achieved what can be called the green transition. In the world today, for many years before, so much talk about green transition in Europe, in the United States. Now, the United States say no, they did not care. Donald Trump is not interested. Europe will also talk less and less about this whole subject. But in China, it's done, especially in last year, in the year 2025. So much has been achieved.
Yeah, well, I look forward to hearing more from Professor Zhang later in this very interesting contrast between certainty and uncertainty. But first, let me, as I said, get to Professor Jorge Sachs on the line here. And Happy New Year, Professor Sachs, and welcome to our show as always. Against the backdrop of the turbulences, the transformations we're seeing around the world, which word would you choose to define 2025, and where does China fit in?
Well, thank you very much, and Happy New Year to everybody. We're in a massively disrupted period. The world order is changing. The physical earth is changing, the technology is changing, and within that, I regard China as being the core protagonist in the world for getting to where we want to go, to a more stable, global, rules-based or law-based order, and with the new technologies that can help us. So I think China's role becomes more and more important. The United States becomes more and more erratic and unstable. I'm sorry to say, Donald Trump is both a cause of instability and a symptom of instability. And as we just heard, the United States has even abandoned the quest for environmental sustainability, but that means that China is indisputably the world leader and the center of the new world green economy. And thankfully, China is pursuing this both in the public sphere and in the private sphere. So 2025 was a very disruptive year. I think 2026 will continue to be very disruptive, but China's role becomes more and more central, especially, of course, for the 80% of the world which we call the emerging and developing economies. Most of the world is not the United States and Europe. The U.S. and Europe are in a kind of political turmoil and confusion and protectionism, but most of the world is not. And most of the world is looking to China as a financial and technological and trade and diplomatic partner. So this is how the world is changing. China's role in it is, of course, becoming ever more central.
Thank you, Professor Sachs. I'm going to let you go there. I understand the infrastructure is not the level that's needed for a live video discussion yet, but hopefully we'll get there. Once again, Happy New Year, and we'll get back to our other guests for more discussion. I'm going to keep that general question on mind. You know, which word would you describe the year 2025, and, you know, where does China fit in? But I'm going to move on to more specific area and go to the other two guests that I haven't asked yet. First, Jorge, it's great to have you on the show again, and it's I really appreciate your insight. May I veer into the area of economy and then have your answer and your insights on looking back at 2025. I'm just going to tell people a little bit about what happened in 2025 in terms of China's economy. For instance, that year was the final year of China's 14th five-year plan, which covered the period from 2020 to 2025. And the first 3 quarters of that year, China registered 5.2% of GDP growth. So it appears, we don't know yet, but it appears that China is well on course to achieve its target of 5% growth. The GDP also is expected to hit $20 trillion this year, the very first time. So that will firmly reaffirm China's status as the world's second largest economy, although we know that in terms of purchasing power, China probably already sitting at the world's top. And international institutions such as the IMF upgraded China's growth forecast for 2025 to 5% from 4.8% for the year. So, Jorge, what does this year mean for China's economy as it pursues its economic development goals?
Sure. No, and let me add one additional figure to the ones you mentioned, and that is that for the first time, China in 2025 will have a $1 trillion trade surplus, which goes to show how its foreign trade, its export capacity continues to thrive, despite the very difficult environment in which the world finds itself. And before dwelling on that, let me just take a step back and refer also to the question that you asked our previous guest. If I had to pick one word to define the world today, I would say it's polycrisis. There is a crisis on many fronts. The economy, peace and security, the environment, natural disasters. There are many things going on at the same time, which makes it particularly challenging, of course. There is a phrase attributed to Lenin, some say it's apocryphal, which goes as follows. There are decades in which nothing happens, and then there are weeks in which decades happen. And I think that is a very good statement on what we have seen in 2025. Now, in that context, and to your question again, it seems to me that in this very volatile environment, China has provided a source of stability and predictability. In the business that I've been in for a long time, which is diplomacy, predictability is extremely important. Governments want to know where they stand, and you can agree or disagree with the stance that China takes, but you know where you stand. And that's not the same that you can say about a number of other powers in the world. In that sense, in economic terms, China's commitment to free trade, for example, at a time when protectionism is running amok around the world. China has signed 23 FTAs with some 30 countries, including 5 in Latin America, including my own. China signed the first FTA with any individual country with Chile in 2005, and it's been very successful. So China's commitment to multilateralism is also extremely important, again, at a time when unilateralism is raising its ugly head. China's commitment, of course, to innovation and to advance in science and technology is extremely important. So it seems to me that in that sense, it's been, I agree with Professor Zhang, this has been an extraordinary year for China.
Yeah.
And I would underline one last thing that is very important. For developing countries around the world, for the Global South, in Asia, in Africa, and Latin America, the growth of China is very important. What is very interesting is, I was looking at the figures, China's exports to the United States this year have gone down by 29%. Yet, China has managed to rack up a trade surplus of $1 trillion. Why? Because it has expanded its trade with the Global South. So I think that's a very important aspect that we should underline.
Yeah. Let me go to Professor Liang. Sorry for keeping you waiting for so long. But I'm going to veer into diplomacy a little bit since Jorge mentioned it, since this is a very important aspect of what happened in China. I know you're an economist, but nevertheless, these are very closely intertwined. For instance, the diplomacy, the number one diplomatic topic probably would be the head of state meeting between Chinese President Xi Jinping and US President Donald Trump in South Korea this year, where they talked about the very important trading issues, tariff arrangement, for instance, that happened between the two countries. How would you describe the year 2025 in terms of diplomacy, but also the spillover effects on other areas?
Yeah, I could agree with you, Liu Xin, and the distinguished panelists, and it was a delight to listen to all the insights. I would say, if I were you to use one word, I would say transformation. And this is transformation that you actually mentioned. And I think this is a description not only for the global economy, right? Despite the onslaught of the Trump's trade war and the disruptions to the global system, the world GDP growth is going to remain at about 3.2%, according to the IMF forecast. And the world trade is actually forecast to grow by 2.4% volume-wise, according to the WTO. So again, I think it's a transformation from the unipolar world to the more multipolar world. And I think diplomacy is one of the manifestations, right, of that transformation into this multipolar world. So you mentioned this very important meeting between President Xi and President Trump. And clearly, I think this is a turning point of Trump's Liberation Day tariff. And it realized that it would not be able to force China, like other countries, to compromise, to cave in. And so I think he take a step back, right, and lower the tariff rate as high as 135% on China to now about 47.5%. So I think this is a major turning point of Trump's unilateral actions toward China and towards the world. And when it comes to diplomacy, I think United States is being one of the country that is significant. But as we also see, China has committed to a high-level opening, and that is reflected in both a unilateral opening when it comes to giving 53 African countries zero tariff, and also open up Hainan, the entire island, as a free trade port. And so these are really significant, not to mention the visa-free policies to over 38 countries. And China is also partnering with other countries at various multilateral platforms, be it BRICS, be it BRI, be it G20, or SCO. And so there are a lot of diplomatic, I think, wins and also progress. I think China is really instilled the sense of stability to the global economy. And hence, I think the transformation that United States can no longer single-handedly really manipulate, right, the global economy. And China is going to contribute 30% of global growth in 2025. Not to mention, I think earlier, the discussions about technological progress and breakthroughs. China, as the middle-income country, first time a middle-income country is able to make it to the top 10 of the Global Innovation Index, right? So I think all of these are remarkable achievements of China, not only in promoting its own economic transformation, but also the global economy and the geopolitical landscape.
Yeah, well, indeed, the transformation, we're seeing profound ones on all levels. I want to come back to Professor Zhang Weiwei. I want to get your insight in this very important step, conceptual step that China took in Tianjin this this year, where China announced its fourth global initiative, which is called the Global Governance Initiative. This would kind of complete the landscape of initiative of ideas China have for what kind of future that China wants to see going forward. How important is that initiative, especially in relation to what you talked about, the certainty that China represents in a very much uncertain world?
This very summit of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization held in Tianjin, and Chinese leader Xi Jinping made this global governance initiative during the summit. He made 5 points, but to my mind, this particular last point, action-oriented, is hugely important because for the whole UN system, there is a problem with somehow, lack actions. So I think it's also one way to promote further reform in the international global governance system and UN system. And Shanghai Cooperation Organization is a good example in that, because you look at the leadership participate in the summit, it's a sign of what kind of progress this organization has made in terms of global governance and regional governance. Central Asia is sandwiched between Asia and Europe. For so many decades, it's described as so-called geographical curse. Yet, thanks to this organization, and to a great degree, thanks to China as well, and China's way of respecting sovereignty, focusing on development and mutual help. So this whole region, Central Asia, has been transformed from geographical curse to geographical bonus. In other words, when Chinese leader Xi Jinping put forward this global initiative, it's backed up not only by ideas, but also by facts, by practice, by good practices, as shown in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization.
Let's move on a little bit from the important diplomatic actions that took place in 2025 to the military arena, where we saw some very bright highlights. And Jorge, I'm going to ask you about how Chinese military advancement was perceived in your part of the world. For instance, to mark the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II, China held a V-Day military parade that showcased the transformation of its armed forces into a modern military armed forces. The parade involved more than 10,000 soldiers, over 100 aircraft, hundreds of advanced ground weapons, all organized under integrated wartime command system. China unveiled its complete nuclear triad, highlighting land, sea, and air-based strategic forces. It was also the first since President Xi launched China's new journey to pursue modernization on all fronts. Meanwhile, China also commissioned its first aircraft carrier, the Fudan. So I'm going to ask you, how is all of that seen in your part of the world, especially against the backdrop of China's development, versus the very much crisis-full world we're seeing?
Yes, absolutely. Well, let me tell you, I watched this parade on television, and it brought back some very fun memories, because I was in Beijing in 2015 when the military parade for the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II took place. So it was quite a moment for me. So there's no doubt that China has made tremendous progress on the military front. And there is an important document that was released, I think it was in May, a defense white paper by the Chinese government, laying out its priorities for years to come, given the very difficult circumstances the world is facing. And one of the things that I found most interesting in that paper is the insistence of the notion of the Asia Pacific. The Asia Pacific was the term we used, for a very long time, until a few years ago, in the United States, they decided to change that to Indo-Pacific and brought this notion of the Indo-Pacific that became quite fashionable. I myself and not quite sure it will hold. But I found it interesting that this Chinese white defense paper insists on the traditional notion of the Asia-Pacific. And the Indo-Pacific framework is facing some problems. For example, a key element of the Indo-Pacific strategy developed by the United States is something called the Quad,
Right.
which brings together Australia, Japan, the United States, and India. Well, the relationship between India and the United States is not at its best moment right now, as we all know. So this notion of the Indo-Pacific, I think, is facing difficulties, and we might see a revival of the notion of the Asia-Pacific, which was the traditional approach that we used to follow.
Yeah, well, of course, I mean, Asia-Pacific is a natural term. Countries that are in, aligning the Pacific Ocean, coming together to discuss, to cooperate, and to improve their situation together is a natural aspiration of countries in the region. Nevertheless, Professor Liang, I know it's not your specific expertise, but looking at the military development, looking at the news, where is China's military standing if you zoom out against the long period of historical development? How will September the 3rd parade go down in history and be remembered?
Well, I think the day will definitely be remembered as a day where China was able to have this forceful display of its military might and also strategic intent. I think for China, this military buildup is really for defensive purposes, right? It is to defend its own national sovereignty, its territorial integrity. It is to safeguard regional stability and peace. China's military budget increase is really in line with its GDP growth. And as we also know, that United States military budget is more than the next 7 countries combined. China's gesture really indicates it will defend itself. It has the capability to defend itself and to maintain the regional stability as well as the sovereign rights.
Yeah, well, all of this has not been made possible without China's technological advances and China's laser-sharp focus on technological innovation. China's AI model, for instance, DeepSeek, at the start of the year 2025, quickly drew global attention. Humanoid robots made headlines, first of all at the Chinese Spring Festival Gala, when robots danced the whole world, of course, including the Chinese people, found it amazing and very, very thought-provoking as well. So, Professor Zhang, let me go to you. What does the year 2025 mean in terms of China's technological innovation? What kind of impact is that going to have going forward?
Indeed, whether it's DeepSeek or Huawei or other Chinese brands, and in AI, in telecommunication, many other technologies, they are all signs of China's tremendous progress. It's a kind of one breakthrough after another in science and technologies. There is one thing, which we have to look at China as it is. China's civilizational state. We have the world's largest population together with India, but this population is also very well educated. Every year, China produces more scientists, engineers than the Western countries combined. And as a result, the size of the Chinese scientists, engineers, lays the basis for China's technological progress. As a result, as you may know, in the last year's report by ASPI, an Australian think tank, which made a calculation of Chinese technology, US technology, they came to a conclusion which is very important, which says basically in 64 critical technologies, most critical technology world today, China leads the United States in 57. That shows a lot, the progress China has made in science and technologies.
Well, going forward, we don't have much time left. I'm going to ask my guests to talk about the challenges laying ahead. For the 15th five-year plan, for instance, in the recommendations, there are more sentences describing the challenges China faces in this period of time than the opportunities. Jorge, what would you caution against?
Well, I would caution against forgetting the significance of promoting domestic demand. I think that China has done very well in its export sector. I mentioned earlier that this $1 trillion trade surplus, a record surplus. But my sense is that domestic demand within China is not picking up at the pace it should. And one of the big questions I had when I was following what was being discussed in the fourth plenum was whether there would be more emphasis on that. My conclusion was that it was a bit mixed. There was some emphasis, but more on the side of production and innovation. And it seemed to me domestic demand is not something that could be sidelined.
Okay. Well, I think there is a great emphasis on that effective domestic demand. We'll keep that in mind. Professor Liang, what are your messages or what will you be looking out for in the year 2026? China versus in the big context of the world.
Well, I think it's clearly written in the 15th five-year plan that China will work on continuous, industrial upgrading, technological breakthroughs, as well as boosting domestic demand. And that includes both optimizing investments, because I think this year the FAI has declined by 2.6% so far by November. And so there's still a lot of room to optimize investments, especially in infrastructure, in green energy, in data centers and other new economies. So I think investments still needs to be budgeted. And that is an important pillar of the domestic demand. On the consumption side, I think there's a lot of evidence that the China's consumption demand is actually being undercounted. In other words, the consumption value is actually larger than the official statistics. But that said, I do see that there is a lot of room for consumption to continue to grow, especially as percent of GDP. Okay. And that can be done by stabilizing the real estate sector and also by some structural transformation, for example, hukou reforms and so on. Yeah. But I think the Chinese government is aware of the importance of the importance of stimulating domestic demand, and I think they will commit to that task.
Yeah, I think the priority is there, but looking from a more comprehensive strategic perspective, Professor Zhang, let me come to you for the last question. Will the crises continue, the turbulences we're seeing, the profound transformation for the worse or for the better, will it intensify in 2026 or the next few years before things get better? What do you predict?
My prediction is that the crisis of this nature will continue worldwide. In many ways, it's a kind of a structural shift from unipolarity to multipolarity. We have to go through this process, no other way out. Yet, fortunately, we have China, indeed, because it's a civilization state. It has succeeded in one way or another, in many ways, its own model of development. So as a result, I think there will be more contribution China can make to make the world more peaceful and less turbulent. Yet there are also limits what China can do. In other words, we have to work together with other countries to make the world a better world.
All right. Well, certainly keep our fingers crossed and let's roll up our sleeves. Many thanks once again to my guests, Professor Jeffrey Sachs early in the show, Professor Zhang Weiwei in Shanghai, Jorge Heine in Chile, and Professor Liang Yan in the United States. Once again, Happy New Year and all the very best to our viewers from around the world who have been paying attention to us and supporting our growth in the year 2025. We will continue to work hard in the year 2026. As usual, on behalf of the whole team, thank you for watching. You've got the point.